I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute here at WSU, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to tell you about two other events, both of them tomorrow, so they're back-to-back. You can go to both. The first is actually a Foley Institute event that we're co-sponsoring with the Business College, or actually the Hoops Institute of Taxation over in the Business College. We have Tom Newbig, who's coming in. He's at the University of Michigan, but he was the former head of the U.S. Treasury Department's tax division, and for 20 years was the head chief economist and head of the tax office for Arthur Young, which is a major accounting firm. He's going to be talking about the tax bills that are going through Congress right now, so that should be a really interesting conversation. That's at 4:30 tomorrow in the Spark building, the new building, Spark G45. And then following that, our speaker today is going to be giving another lecture tomorrow evening. That's at 7 p.m. in Todd Hall 216, where she'll be speaking about the topic of her new book entitled The End of Progress. And so I encourage you to go to both of those events tomorrow. Now today we're very fortunate to have with us someone who can speak to a topic that is unfortunately very topical all of a sudden again. And that is feminism in the era of Donald Trump. Amy Allen is the liberal arts research professor of philosophy and women's and gender and sexuality studies at Penn State University, where she also serves as the head of the philosophy department. Prior to joining Penn State, Amy was the chair of the philosophy department and the head of the women and gender studies program at Dartmouth College. She received her PhD in philosophy from Northwestern University. She is the author of numerous scholarly articles and books, including The Power of Feminist Theory, Domination, Resistance, Solidarity, and The Politics of Ourselves, Power, Autonomy, and Gender in Contemporary Critical Theory. Her most recent book, as I just mentioned, is The End of Progress, Decolonizing the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory, which was published by Columbia University Press. She is also the editor of the Columbia University Press series, New Directions in Critical Theory. So join me now in welcoming Amy Allen.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and to all of you for coming out. First I want to issue a caveat of sorts. Maybe it's a dodge even, I don't know. But you might have seen the poster for this talk, which is gorgeous, by the way. It's a beautiful poster. But if you can read down on the fine print, it poses a question that is at least implied that I'm going to try to answer in this talk. And the question is, where does feminism go from here? And I just want to start by saying, I am not going to try to answer that question in this talk. I'm not going to pretend that I have that much insight into our current political moment, so there's a kind of modesty, I think, about why I'm not going to try to answer it. But there's also a kind of principled reason, which is that, as Clayton just said, I mean, my work is primarily in critical theory and feminist critical theory, and as I understand it, it's not really the job of the critical theorist to kind of prescribe paths for social activists or movements to try to follow. Instead, I think it's really the job of the critical theorist to try to identify and analyze problems in the present, to try to understand them in all of their depth and complexity, and to give some understanding of how they came to have the shape that they have. So I understand critical theory and feminist critical theory to be engaged in a kind of history of the present that I think can generate some ideas about possible paths forward. But as I understand it, these are only going to emerge on the basis of a kind of rigorous analysis of where we are now and how we got here. So that's all I'm going to try to talk about today, and I'd be happy to just talk in the Q&A about thoughts about where we go from here. Okay, so where are we, at least from a feminist point of view? Well, we live in a world where a spectacularly unqualified, temperamentally inappropriate man who's bragged about sexual assault, made fun of the disabled, and regularly spews racist and xenophobic rhetoric was elected president of the United States. I mean, I think there's a lot one could say about how we got to this point, and I'm not going to attempt to give a fully worked out answer to this question. I don't think that's something I could possibly do in 20 to 30 minutes. But I do think that trying to answer this question is really crucially important for figuring out possible progressive paths forward. So what I'm going to try to do in the time that I have today is to compare three narratives that have emerged from the left, let's say, from leftist or progressive commentators, trying to explain Trump's rise. And I'm going to call them the sexism narrative, the white working class narrative, and the racism narrative. And my overall point, just to preview it, is going to be that although these narratives are often presented by people who are putting them forward as competing explanations of Trump's rise, I think it's crucial, just in general, but especially for anyone who identifies as a feminist, to understand that each of these narratives contains an important truth, and that I don't think we'll be able to figure out how we can move forward until we understand those truths and how they fit together. So what I'm going to do is to kind of go through these three narratives and then say a few words at the end about how I can see them fitting together. And I'm drawing on sources that I have listed here on this slide. So primarily for this, what I'm calling the sexism narrative, I'm referring to Susan Bordeaux's recent book, The Destruction of Hillary Clinton. But to some extent, Hillary Clinton herself offers a version of this narrative in her campaign postmortem, What Happened? Although actually Clinton, I think, gives a somewhat more complicated picture than even Bordeaux does. For the white working class narrative, I'm going to be talking about George Packer's piece in The New Yorker, which was actually published before the election, just before the election, and draws heavily on J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. And then for the racism narrative, I'm looking at Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, We Were 8 Years in Power. Okay, so I'm going to start with what I'm calling the sexism narrative. So Susan Bordeaux, in her book, The Destruction of Hillary Clinton, says that her main question, the main question she wants to try to answer, is the following. How could such an extraordinarily well-qualified, experienced, admired, and accomplished candidate, speaking of Clinton here, whose victory seemed assured and would have been as unprecedented as that of Barack Obama's, come to be seen as a tool of the establishment, a chronic liar, and a talentless politician? How did this happen? Now, I think Bordeaux gives a kind of complicated answer to this question, and she places a lot of the blame at the feet of FBI Director James Comey and the press's coverage of the email scandal, and also at the foot of Bernie Sanders and his branding of Clinton as a tool of the Wall Street establishment. But it's sexism and misogyny that really play the crucial role in Bordeaux's account. And here's a quote from Bordeaux's book that I think summarizes her point. So Bordeaux notes that throughout her career, Hillary Clinton has been a living Rorschach test of people's nightmare images of female power. It's no surprise that as she came closer to the most powerful position in the world, the misogyny directed toward her became increasingly vicious, almost medieval. Now, in case you doubt whether or not this claim is true, I'm going to offer just two little pieces of evidence. These are two images from the mainstream media from the year 1993. The one on the left is from the New York Times Magazine, and it ran across from the headline Saint Hillary, and it's a drawing of Hillary as a medieval saint. And the one on the right is from the cover of Spy Magazine, in which Clinton is portrayed as a dominatrix. I mean, I don't think there's a better representation of one person exemplifying the Madonna horror kind of image that is central to a lot of sexist and misogynist imagery than this, than these set of images. One could offer a lot more. I mean, I chose these because they're from the same year and because they're so kind of striking, I think, in terms of their opposition. So this is a large part of Bordeaux's argument, but she argues that this explanation of Clinton's defeat has been largely rejected, and that when feminists have offered this explanation, they're accused of so-called playing the woman card, to include by Bernie Sanders and many of his supporters who have rejected this explanation. So both Bordeaux and Clinton herself analyze, I think pretty astutely, the double bind that women political candidates face. The more ambitious they are, the less likable, less authentic, and less trustworthy they seem. And I think Hillary Clinton is really, in many ways, the poster child for this double bind. Clinton herself puts it this way, and these are two quotes from her book, What Happened. I can't count the number of times that good-hearted men who should know better dismiss the notion that sexism and outright misogyny are still potent forces in our national life. But things have changed, they say, as Donald Trump brags about groping women and a few weeks later wins the presidency as his rally-goers chant, "Trump that bitch." And similarly, she goes on to say, sexism and misogyny played a role in the 2016 presidential election. Exhibit A is that the flagrantly sexist candidate won. A whole lot of people listened to the tape of him bragging about sexually assaulting women, shrugged, and said, he still gets my vote. The fact that he's now questioning the authenticity of the Access Hollywood tapes doesn't change, I think, what Clinton says here. He wasn't disputing the authenticity of that tape at the time, and many people, in fact, many women said, he still gets my vote. Okay, so this is one kind of explanation. Now, as I just alluded to, though, things are a little bit more complicated largely because of the demographics of how the vote broke down. So, as many of you are probably aware, 53% of white female voters voted for Trump. And 62% of white female voters without college degrees voted for Trump. And that's as compared to only 4% of black female voters and 26% of Latina voters who voted for Trump. Which suggests that either a lot of white women are sexist, which is possible, or don't care that much about sexism to be motivated to vote, to have it change their vote. Or I think that sexism and misogyny are not the whole story. And I think this was pointed out by many black and women of color feminists after the election in the run-up to the Women's March on Washington, that the problem may have more to do with whiteness and with white feminism than many white feminists are willing to admit. So I'm going to come back to that point a bit later on. Now, there are some complications here that are going to lead me to talk about the next narrative, the white working class narrative. Bordeaux places a lot of blame on what she calls a generational split that turned millennial feminists away from Clinton and towards Sanders. So the idea is that millennials thought that second-wave feminist identity politics was passé, and that Sanders pulled a kind of classic male Marxist move of dismissing everything other than economic concerns as secondary issues that the revolution will take care of along the way. Clinton herself discusses the charge that was made often by Sanders and his supporters that she ignored economic issues or ignored the plight of the working class, and she insists in her account of the campaign that this isn't true. But she also acknowledges that working class whites have been moving away from the Democratic Party for a long time and that this played a crucial role in the election. What I think she doesn't really do in her book is come to terms with why that's the case and the role of the Clinton political legacy in that move away. And this is where I think George Packer's analysis of the white working class narrative is interesting. So I'm going to turn to that now. So Packer argues that Trump's, and here's a quote from his article in The New Yorker, that Trump's core voters are revealed by poll after poll to be members of the white working class. His campaign has made them a self-conscious identity group. They're one among many factions in the country today, their mutual suspicions flaring, the boundaries between them hardening. A disaster on this scale belongs to no single set of Americans, and it will play out long after the November election, regardless of the outcome. Trump represents the whole country's failure. Now, Packer's overall argument is pretty complicated, actually, but a large part of it is that the Democratic Party has, since the early 1990s, ceased to be the party of the working class and has instead become the party of technocratic, highly educated, cosmopolitan elites. And it's kind of a implicit, he doesn't put a fine point on this, but it's interesting that that transformation of the Democratic Party was led by Bill Clinton and what was then called the Third Way that emerged out of his Democratic Leadership Council. as a way of getting Democrats back in power in presidential politics. So led by Bill Clinton and the Third Way on Packer's analysis, the Democratic Party joined forces with Wall Street, deregulating financial markets, and championed a form of globalization that benefited American elites and impoverished the working class, all while promoting socially progressive values like diversity, multiculturalism, and feminism that are, as the story goes, alien to more culturally conservative working class whites who used to vote Democratic. So that's kind of, as I see it, the core of Packer's argument. And he analyzes here, interestingly, President Obama's famous, remark about how people who've been left behind by economic circumstances, quote, cling to guns and religion. If you recall, that was a remark that he made during the 2008 campaign, for which he took a lot of heat. And in explicating this white working class explanation, Packer says the following, this is the next quote: Obama was expressing the widespread liberal attitude toward Republican voting workers. That is, he didn't take them seriously. Guns and religion, as much as jobs and incomes, are the authentic interest of millions of Americans. Trade and immigration have failed to make their lives better and arguably left them worse off. And if the Democratic Party was no longer on their side, if government programs kept failing to improve their lives, why not vote for the party that at least took them seriously? And this, basically, as Packer sees it, Clinton made the same mistake with the basket of deplorables comment. Now, one point I want to note about this is that this white working class narrative is for Packer as much about race and cultural identity as it is about class understood in narrow economic terms. So he tries to make this clear when he explains that the term the white working class mixes race and class into a volatile compound, privilege and disadvantage crammed into a single phrase. And when he acknowledges that Trump voters tended to be more deficient in social capital than economic capital. So he's, I think, pretty aware of the fact that, in fact, the average Trump supporter was not poor, but had a median income of $72,000, as we know in the sort of all demographics that were done after the election. So it's not so much about simply economic position, but about how race and a particular economic position kind of have been put together into this new identity category of the white working class. He acknowledges also that Trump voters tended to be not necessarily economically worse off, but they did tend to be less educated, in worse health, and more pessimistic about the prospects for their children. And they were also significantly more likely to live in all-white neighborhoods, all-white, racially, ethnically segregated enclaves. And in fact, this more than anything else is what characterizes the kind of average Trump voter. And this brings me then to the third narrative, the racism narrative, which is pretty powerfully articulated by Ta-Nehisi Coates in his recent book, We Were 8 Years in Power. So Coates argues that it's a mistake to think that Trump has no real ideology. In fact, Trump's ideology is white supremacy. And in fact, he describes Trump as the first white president, by which he means he's the first president who was elected solely because of his whiteness, who, were it not for the fact that he was white, he could not have been elected. I think this is a pretty compelling argument, although he builds a lot of it, Coates does, in critical response to other commentators, including Packer, who have argued that Trump's rise can be explained by the resentments and anxieties of the white working class without also taking into account racism. So as I see it, Coates' objection to that story is that people who want to put forward the white working class narrative talk too much about the working class resentments and not enough about the role that whiteness, and particularly about white supremacy, plays in the formation of the white working class as a cultural identity. So Coates makes a historical argument designed to show that the white working class has always been defined in opposition to blacks, initially to black slaves. There was a contrast between black slaves and white indentured servants that he sort of traces this opposition between the white working class and blacks back to. And he argues that racial solidarity has basically always trumped class solidarity in the United States. So the white working class has been, on Coates' view, has long been the agent of racist terrorism, which then is explained away in narratives of the white working class as the side effect of the ravages of capitalism. So as I read him, Coates' argument is not so much that there is nothing to the white working class explanation of Trump's rise, but rather that it's whiteness and not class that do most of the work in that explanation, or that should do most of the work in that explanation. And that trying to make this about class only, without talking about the role of white supremacy, only obscures the persistent and deeply entrenched racism in our country, including, and maybe even especially in his view, the racism of working class whites, whose, on his view, entire identity is staked on that of being superior to blacks. I think he's also worried that this narrative serves to absolve white commentators and journalists of their own complicity in the white supremacy that fuels Trump's support. And you could see this in a number of the responses by black feminists and women of color feminists after the election, who, basically said to the white women who were beginning to talk about organizing a large protest, like, we don't want your solidarity, like, you guys need to get your own house in order, basically. This is a white feminism problem. And until feminists come to terms with that, we're not going to get anywhere. Okay, so to just kind of summing up the way that this narrative goes, Coates' argument is that the real problem is not that Democrats are no longer the party of the working class. The real problem, as he says, is that Democrats aren't the party of white people, working or otherwise. White workers are not divided by the fact of labor from other white demographics. They are divided from all other laborers by the fact of their whiteness. And he goes on to say, very much echoing, I think, the way that Clinton talks about the role of sexism in the election, certainly not every Trump voter is a white supremacist, just as not every white person in the Jim Crow South was a white supremacist, but every Trump voter felt it was acceptable to hand the fate of our country over to one. So they, understood that he was a white supremacist and said, he still gets my vote. Okay, so those are the three narratives. And my main point, which I'm really interested to talk to you guys about and see what you think too, is that I think the problem I see is that these narratives tend to propose an either or kind of choice. So either Trump won because of sexism and misogyny that placed Clinton into an unwinnable double bind and allowed him to get a free pass for bragging about sexual assault and leering comments about his own daughter and the many other sexist things that he has done. Or he won because the Democratic Party long ago sold its soul to Wall Street and became the party of highly educated cosmopolitan elites, supporting policies that enhanced rather than ameliorated income inequality, and lost touch with the white working class voters who form the core of Trump's support. Or he won because of a white supremacist backlash against these still far from complete gains of the civil rights movement, gains that culminated in the election of the first black president. And I think, to varying degrees, the different versions of these narratives that I've laid out, present this as a kind of either or choice. Like Coates very specifically and explicitly is arguing against Packer and against the white working class explanation. But I think even someone like Bordeaux is putting some distance between the kind of Sanders, class-focused explanation and the feminist explanation, and trying to kind of make force an either or choice. Interestingly, the person who comes closest to the view that I want to put forward is Clinton herself, who at the end of her book, in a chapter titled "Why," it comes very close to the point that I want to make, which is that the answer to this question has to be D, all of the above. And I think to look at how we got to where we are and what is the current situation of feminism in the age of Trump in this way would be to try to see it through the lens of what feminists call intersectionality, which is a theory that highlights interlocking or intersecting systems of oppression and privilege. So I want to just note as a sideline, and I can say more about this in the questions if people are interested. As I understand it, intersectionality is not about identities intersecting with one another, but rather about systems of power relations intersecting with one another. So we talk about racism and sexism and class exploitation and oppression intersecting with one another. And that has to be somehow the framework that we use to understand how we got here. Now, interestingly, intersectionality theory emerged out of Black feminism in response to the ways that single-axis theories of oppression, that is, theories that focused on the oppression of women as women, or that focused on racial oppression without also thinking about gender, distorted the experiences of women of color by compelling them to identify either with white women or Black men. In other words, intersectionality theory emerged as a response to the inadequacies of an earlier iteration of what we might now call white feminism. So if feminism is about diagnosing and critiquing relations of gender oppression that affect all women, not just white women, then it has to be intersectional. And so I would say that a truly feminist analysis of how we got where we are would have to be an intersectional one that attempts to understand the element of truth in all three of the narratives that I've just presented, and to think through how they're interconnected. Thank you.
So we got about half an hour for questions. Discussion.
Should I call on people?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you for this. I just agree with every word you just said. As a sociologist, I am impressed with all three of these narratives, and I think there is intersectionality among them. But as a political junkie, I would add a fourth.
Okay.
And that is, I think, frankly, she ran a terrible campaign.
Yeah.
And I'm someone who believes that campaigns still matter. Mm-hmm. And apparently, as you read the obituaries after the fact of what happened, she didn't apparently listen very much to her own husband or to Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And she went with a strategy that Penn and others said, this is how you win. You don't have to worry about places like Pennsylvania. And I think there was a lot of arrogance in that campaign mm-hmm. that came home to roost, mm-hmm. in addition to these three narratives. Yeah. And to me, Comey just tipped it over the edge.
Yeah.
It shouldn't have been close enough to tip over the edge.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree, and I guess I would want to say, like, I didn't intend this as a complete explanation
Sure.
of why Clinton lost. So because I think, yeah, if you wanted to do that, you'd have to say a lot about. I guess one thing I would say is, yeah, it seemed like the campaign was a mess, but it can't be the case that the Trump campaign was a well-oiled machine, right? I mean, that was kind of a hot mess too, right? So I don't know how much that, but also the Comey emails, the WikiLeaks, the Russian interference. I mean, you'd have to have a much more complicated
Sure.
story. And Clinton, if you read the book, I mean, it's I think it's worth reading. Actually, there's a long discussion of the emails. That's a really long discussion. So, and I haven't touched on any of that. But I guess I would say, some of those things I think probably did tip the scales. But what they don't answer is, why was it close in the first place?
Exactly.
Why was it close in the first place? I mean, given the kind of candidate and now President Trump is. And that's the part that I think these narratives are trying to get at, is that kind of deeper question.
Where I just follow up, those three narratives are also lingering issues, as opposed to a new candidate who might not have the WikiLeaks and might, next time around with the election. Might run a better campaign in some respects, but these problems don't.
Well, some of them are specific, though. I think. I mean, actually, I do think Hillary Clinton herself is a kind of a. I think the Bordeaux's sort of right that there's a way in which she's really heavily linked to kind of like a certain style of feminism that maybe is a little bit out of tune with a generational change. I mean, so there are all these debates leading up to the election of like, can you be a good feminist and support Bernie Sanders, right? And it's like, well, yeah, you know, we're supposed to be beyond identity politics in some sense, and like it's not necessarily that just because she's a woman makes her the best feminist candidate. And maybe now I think Bernie. Okay, I voted for Bernie in the Pennsylvania primary, and I think he's great in many ways, but I don't actually think he's necessarily great on women's issues. So, which I think would be how you would sort of sort that out. But I do think that whole debate was partly about Clinton being associated with a certain style of feminism or way of thinking about feminism that seems a little old-fashioned now. Also, I think, and this is what Coates really brings out, which maybe I didn't kind of emphasize enough, is like, so much of this is about Obama. So much of this is about a kind of backlash against Obama, I think, and a sort of revanchist rejection of him and his legacy, and so in that sense, it's very contextually specific, and maybe wouldn't, a different female candidate running at a different moment, these kinds of issues might not have come into play as much, I think. Oh, yeah.
Do you think that because maybe like Trump had like a bona fide like rhetoric about his campaign with build the wall, do you think that made like a difference between how he won and how she lost? Like, do you think that made a difference?
Mm-hmm.
Because she didn't really,
have
she
a
had time
messaging.
with her, but like, that wasn't something that people could really get around. I don't think.
Yeah.
He had something that apparently people liked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that goes back to the first question about there seemed to be a difficulty of finding a message and one that resonated. I think that's
I'm
true.
not a supporter of Trump
Yeah.
or anything, but like, I just think that it was a good strategy to get a defined rhetoric.
Yeah, and I guess I wouldn't disagree. I also sort of shared the view that many people expressed that Clinton's doesn't have kind of the naturalness of campaigning, and that there was a lot of there is a way in which I think this is very gender-coded, but the worry about her not seeming authentic enough, but I do think that people didn't find her authentic enough, and that the not having a clear message that stayed consistent throughout the whole campaign may have been part of it, or may have been a symptom of that. So again, I would just say, like, the narratives, the way I'm trying to think about this is, like, what is it about the build the wall narrative that struck a chord with people? Yeah, and that's, to me, I think Trump was tapping into something that...
It was just like, I feel like it could have been like kind of catchy. I don't know, like something that people see every day, like on Twitter, or like when he's tweeting about it, build the wall, we're gonna build it, and like, it's just like, make America great again, like this whole like tone of this campaign was just kind of boastful. Like,
Yeah, definitely. And I do think, I got in trouble for saying this just with some of my, progressive friends, whatever, like, the first time I saw him speak, I thought, oh, we're in trouble, because he's actually quite charismatic. And I said that, like, doesn't mean I am a fan, it just means, like, I could see the kind of charisma that he's able to...
He's good in front of the camera.
Yeah. Sure. So I think that's right. But I guess what I would say is, I think the Coates narrative, which I really agree with a lot of, says, look, okay, yes, build the wall is a catchy slogan, and make America great again is a catchy slogan, but they're also both very racially inflected slogans, right? And so what is it about that message? It's not just about the catchiness of the slogan, it's also about something about the message is being effective and striking.
That's what made like the white voters vote for Trump, I guess. Or the white women voters, 67% were uneducated, like you said.
Yeah.
And my thing is, I was also, so a big part of why Obama got elected and everything things is because he was one of those like first kind of presidents besides Bill Clinton to really embrace this use of social media with young people. And my thing is there not only like a kind of racially divided like white feminism, or is it, there's like, I know a lot of people my age couldn't really get behind Hillary Clinton because she seemed like a very like era of feminism that didn't really connect with young people, and seeing like Trump use this base of like social media in a way that was intensely inappropriate, but in a way that nobody else had, that it was like a constant thing whether you wanted to or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just didn't know if it's not only like maybe just white feminism, but like that group of young white feminists who heard the same things from their parents, like young girls tend to do exactly what their parents did.
Mm-hmm.
And so it transpires generations at that point.
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are generational splits. I mean, that, you know, although Trump did much better with older voters than he did with younger voters, just kind of across the board. So, but I think this was a big, probably dynamic in the primaries. And I mean, it's all, you know, all three of those candidates, Sanders, Trump, and Clinton, are basically of the same generation. But I think she was probably, and she admits it in the book, actually, she was less adept at, you know, that's her whole explanation, basically, for the email thing, actually, is that she just was, she's kind of technologically really, unsavvy, let's put it that way. And so, so she didn't want to have two phones, and she didn't, you know, I mean, she like had never used a personal computer in her work, ever. Like, that's kind of mind-boggling, right? But, you know, she was already first lady, I think, before everybody used a personal computer all the time in their work. And at that point, she had a staff who would do the stuff that you do on your computer for you, you know, so she's never done that. So, I mean, I think, yeah, but of course, it's not just about age, it's about proficiency with certain kinds of technological media, right? Which I think she's clearly not as adept with. So I do think that's part of it. Yeah.
Well, and I just, one more thing on that. I think it's really interesting how he's so, like, even successfully manipulated the media in a way that he used it in such a negative tone and was so, like, oh, the media's out to get you. But that's primarily his platform of, like, voice.
Yeah.
And so...
It's also just completely not true. I mean,
Yeah.
in the sense that he got, like, the mainstream media went way softer on him than on Clinton.
Yeah.
Way. I mean, so, like, the most coverage of, you know, that had to do with the campaign had to do with her email scandal, and a lot of it came from the New York Times. So, you know, but I think there's a complicated dynamic there where, like, mainstream media are so worried about being called out for liberal bias that they sort of overcorrect and try to, you know, in the interest of being balanced and even-handed, you know, sort of give the Democratic candidates a hard time. There's also a longer history of the relationship between the Clintons and the media that I think, you know, makes this particular case more complicated. But yeah, but you're right. But I think there's also, like, so it's a weird false equivalency there.
Yeah, I was just wondering if she'd, like, ever mentioned anything in her book about how, like, she felt personally discriminated against by the media, because I felt like there was a lot of that personally, like...
Yeah, she does discuss that, yeah. Personally discriminated against is probably too strong, but I think she talks about how, I mean, and it's just true. The New York Times, for example, ran a couple of really misleading stories about the email scandal that they then later had to retract, but, like, did a lot of damage before they retracted them, so hand in the back, yeah.
This is, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I was thinking about the feminism narrative as having in sense it's two expressions. Like, there's the we don't want to vote for Hillary Clinton because she's a woman and we think the man is going to do a better job. And then that other side, which is that it's okay to vote for a man who is blatantly sexist.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if you could talk about those two narratives, those two kind of different mechanisms for sexism.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that's why I showed those two images of Hillary from the early 90s. I mean, I think my own sense is sort of over time, the image of Clinton that solidified in the public's minds was more the dominatrix one, right? I mean, so people might find the Saint Hillary kind of image surprising, but it was based on the fact that, you know, when she was kind of initially became well known in public life, I mean, partly as Bill Clinton's, the First Lady of Arkansas and then of the United States, but also on her own through the commencement speech that she gave at Wellesley College, which was, like, nationally publicized at the time. she was this kind of like idealistic do-gooder, you know, like I want to not just, you know, change new policies, but like make everybody like make this a kinder, gentler nation kind of thing. And so the St. Hillary thing was kind of poking fun at that. But I think the image that kind of, you know, for people who weren't alive then and didn't live through that, you know, the image that probably has kind of stayed has been more the one of the like overly ambitious, power hungry, you know, wants power for its own sake, and will do anything to get it, you know, kind of dominatrix image. And so yes, and I think you know, if you look at studies or interviews with Trump voters, some of them would say, you know, it was really a kind of vote again. I could never vote for Clinton, you know. So I think that's part of it, but that's different from the, oh yes, I see, you know, I heard what, you know, the Access Hollywood tape said, and would vote for Trump anyway. I think some of that was, you know, I mean, but they both have this kind of interesting, they intersect with this sort of cultural category of the white working class. I mean, they're both a kind of rejection of the sort of elitist feminism, you know, political correctness kind of thing, right? That we don't want, yeah, I'm uncomfortable with a woman being too powerful, but I also, you know, I don't want anyone telling me, you know, policing like, you know, raucous locker room talk or whatever. It's just the way guys talk, doesn't mean anything, whatever. So they're distinct but somehow connected, I think. That's right. Yeah. I'm not sure what else to say other than, I mean, I think even if you thought, no, Clinton was just a flawed candidate, and you know, and this stuff about her is the dominatrix is old news or whatever, and like that's not the main thing that motivated people. I think her point that it's enough of a problem from a sort of feminist point of view that that people heard what Trump said about women and decided that it didn't matter. That's sort of the bottom line, like I think. I'm not sure. Yes.
One of your early quotes in the sexism argument was from that Clinton book where she says that people don't give enough credence to the extent that sexism is alive and well. And in the last couple of weeks,
Yeah.
whoa. I will say, you know, I think even for women, it has sort of solidified, you know, the stories that we haven't told each other even.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, oh my God, this is rampant. And I think for a lot of men, it has been quite shocking that the extent to which women who they know have said, oh yeah, yeah, me too. Do you think, so you know, this narrative continues onward beyond the campaign into where we are now. I mean, I'm sort of interested in how this particular moment belongs within this context, but also what this moment might mean about making more explicit, oh yeah, sexism and misogyny is alive and well in all of our daily lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, actually, because I've been thinking about that a lot as I was working on this talk, and I mean, just thinking about it generally, I think as many of us have been, but also thinking about it, how it intersects with this talk, and I'm not sure what to say. I mean, I think it's really, really good and important for survivors of sexual harassment and assault to, you know, speak their truth and be heard and believed and not be ashamed and so on. So all of that is, I think, really important. And you know, so the question is like, is this a watershed moment? Does this mean everything is changing? Yeah, I don't know. Time will tell. I mean, I have to say I'm a little pessimistic. I'm pessimistic by nature, I'll admit that, but I mean, the title of my book is The End of Progress, so
That's a giveaway.
Yeah, exactly. So but you know, what's striking to me is that so far as I know anyway, the fields where this Me Too movement is really like gaining some traction and having some effect are entertainment and media, a little bit academia. what do those fields have in common? Well, that's the left-wing, establishment, right? Do I think that this movement, which is important, is going to gain traction more broadly? That, that, for example, the women who voted for Trump will now rethink, and reassess, and I'm not sure. I mean, I don't see it. I worry a little bit that it's, it's something that's causing a lot of upheaval. And maybe even as a response, I mean, I heard someone say this on NPR, I can't remember now who, and I thought it was really right, that in some way it's like an expression of the frustration over the first narrative. It's like, how could the pussy grabber in chief, we couldn't do anything about that. And now, okay, here's something we can do something about, Harvey Weinstein and, and others like him. So that it's a kind of response to the frustration of not having been able to stop Trump. And that, and that's understandable, I think, but I do worry a little bit that, not to say that it's not justified, but it's going to be a kind of moment of the left eating its own that won't have a broader impact. So, like, if I had to make a prediction, I would bet that Al Franken is forced to give up his seat and Roy Moore is elected to the Senate and allowed to stay. Like, that's how I suspect it will play out. And I think, very cynically, that people in the right-wing media are either not talking about Me Too, or if they're talking about it, they're using it as an opportunity to go after, they're gleefully watching people try to take down people like Franken, and not cleaning their own house. So I just think it's so complicated, because I do think I think it's powerful and important, but may have some unintended political consequences.
Let me just follow up on that, because I agree. I think Roy Moore very well may win. Donald Trump obviously won as a Republican.
Yeah.
I think Franken's in trouble. Conyers is going to be in trouble. I think he's going to be forced out. And this is about partisanship.
Yeah.
And party ID. And so we've talked a lot about different types of identities, but where they come together politically is in party structures. Mm-hmm. And we know there's lots of data that suggests 90% of the people who voted for Trump were Republican. Mm-hmm. 90% that voted for Hillary Clinton were Democrats. I mean, that's what motivates political behaviors.
Yeah.
So what does that tell us about these two-party coalitions right now?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question, but I do think that, one way to think about that is what's the direction of the Democratic Party, right? And how can it gain the kind of coalition or majority that would be needed, right? Because it's not going to, it has to be about the restructuring of the party, actually, not just about the particular candidate. I mean, we've seen the presidential elections, they're so close. They're almost always really close in terms of popular vote, because the country's very deeply divided along partisan lines. So, I think I'm somewhat comforted, although this is a really cold comfort, maybe, that the demographics are in favor of the Democratic Party in the long, maybe even the medium run. I mean, as Coates said, and I think he's right, that the Democratic Party is no longer the party of whites, but the demographics in the country are changing, and the country's becoming less white, and so that means, looking ahead for the Democratic Party, that's its hope. But of course, that's exactly why the Republicans are really trying to crack down on immigration. I mean, I think they're quite explicit about that on right-wing radio. It's like, we cannot let all these immigrants in because they're all going to vote Democratic. So, I don't know. It's not an answer. I don't know how to answer the question, but I think you're right that that this is about party politics largely. But the question is, people do, as we know historically, like, parties change. They can have these watershed moments where the party affiliations will flip. That may be one of the results of this. I mean, I think the Republican Party is clearly very internally divided, and it's not clear whether it can withstand the Trumpist populist assault. And so it may become something very different as a result. Cool. lots of hands. I'm going to call on people who haven't spoken yet. Yes?
Do you think that Hillary's choice to not address, possibly cordially, his direct intimidation during debates or his specific comments on her femininity, like her period or whatever, do you think that that was helpful or hurtful, or was she caught in like a catch-22 of woman card versus...
I think there's no way she could have won that situation. Yeah, like, so the debate, should she have turned around, like, back off, I mean, I don't see, especially given how her personality is read, like, I don't see how that would come across as anything but her being a bitch. I mean, you'd have to, like, it would require such a light touch, to somehow, like, make light a joke of it or something. That's not Clinton's style, So I just think, that's where I think, there's a grain of truth in that sexism narrative. There are either enough people who are still sexist or, and even women who react negatively to women in positions of power, or to react negatively to women saying that's sexy, calling out sexism or something like that, that it just becomes really politically fraught if you try to do it. I mean, she writes about that in the book, actually, and I kind of feel for her a little bit. I mean, she says, well, maybe it was a mistake for me to try to maintain my composure, and it would have been better to have a kind of more authentic response. But of course, the only way she survived in politics as long as she did is by remaining, I mean, if you're a woman in a position of authority, you can't, lose your composure, because then you're a crazy bitch, I mean, so you have to keep so there is this kind of, like, no-win situation, I think, there. Yes, please.
So, this is like a comment about different cultures. So in America, I think we can all identify that there's this underlying sexism, different standards for different genders. Okay, and so even your comment about the authenticity of Clinton. So we had to worry about Clinton's authenticity, yet I guess Trump got a pass on that. And so my question is, I wonder, can we learn from other countries? For example, in Germany, we have this amazing, strong, intelligent woman, Angela Merkel. So how did she survive all of these criticisms?
Yeah. So that's interesting, and actually, I don't want to take credit for this idea, but I think it's probably there's something to it. Clinton talks about this in the book as well, that there's something about parliamentary structures that make it easier for women to succeed than about a presidential system, because in a parliamentary structure, you're working, like, together with members of the party and advancing a kind of concrete agenda and so on, that it's somehow easier for women to kind of emerge out of that as acceptable leaders, as opposed to a presidential structure. It has to be like, I want to run to be president, right? So there's this kind of declaration of ambition that's required from the start, and that immediately sort of produces this response of, like, well, who does she think she is, and, like, an ambitious woman, oh my God, we're so freaked out by this, So that seems plausible to me, but I haven't, I think you'd have to do some kind of comparative studies to sort of test that hypothesis, but it strikes me as pretty plausible, and I think it would be right to say that you've seen more women emerge as leaders in that kind of structure than obviously we haven't had a successful woman president in the U.S. system. I mean, there's also the Electoral College. There's so many complicated things there too, because we shouldn't forget that if we didn't have the Electoral College, then Clinton would be president now. So, yeah, but I think that's a really important question. I mean, I don't think it's the case that there's less sexism in Germany. So I've actually spent a fair amount of time there, and in many ways they're more progressive on gender issues than we are in the U.S., and in many ways I think way more traditional, way more. So, I wouldn't say that. I think there's something about the structure of national politics that probably explains it.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about this intersectionality, this kind of three narratives. Can you give examples, or would you think further about it, kind of where they come together?
Yeah.
So that's my first question, and the other question is in terms of, like, feminism now, where should feminists go from now, given, like, its class and racial biases? How should we organize these continuing narratives that we're facing more strongly than ever nowadays? where do we go from now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much to say about the first question. I think I would, I'd want to think more about it. I mean, I think I have some specific ideas about, the way these different narratives play out at points where I would say, oh, but wait a minute, it's more complicated than that, but in terms of like producing an overall intersectional analysis, I haven't even tried. So, in terms of so that's just a I would want to think more about it before I try to say. In terms of the second question, though, I mean, I think what someone like Coates does, and other, there were definitely a lot of Black feminists and feminists of color who made similar points right after the election, is to really, I mean, once again, because this is not the first time in the history of the feminist movement that this has happened, but to really push white feminists to interrogate their own whiteness. And I think that has to be, and their own, and the role that race and racism, both in the level of individual attitudes and structurally, is playing in the current political situation. So I think where feminism has to go from here, I mean, in terms of as an intellectual project, it has to engage really, really seriously with work in critical philosophy of race, and also with a kind of more old-fashioned critique of capitalism, I mean, something that you have written about very much yourself. So I think, then politically, I think, the challenge should be to try to build coalitions, but I think the difficulty is, and this is something that we saw play out, and maybe get pretty well resolved for the Women's March, but it wasn't totally seamless, that initially that was sort of viewed as a march that was, it wasn't a march that was being organized by white women, and it was viewed as a kind of white feminist response. And then there had to be a moment of like, okay, wait a minute, and we need to have women of color. We can't just have white feminists saying, we need a coalition, if they're not going to be willing to like come to terms with the roles that white supremacy has played in Trump's election. And so I think there was then an attempt to work through that, and it was, in that particular instance, reasonably successful. But what's kind of dismaying about it is the way that the kind of initial response just repeated that same problem of white feminists sort of speaking as the voice of feminism and not being attuned to the role that whiteness played in that, and being a little bit tone deaf to the kind of call for coalition, and then needing to be corrected. I mean, that's just the same kind of dynamic, I think, that we saw play out over and over again throughout the 70s, for example, and a lot of those debates amongst feminists. So I think the answer has to be, I mean, I don't see what something like coalition building, I'm not sure what other alternative there would be politically, but I think that's really, really difficult to do, and it's not going to be, feminists aren't going to be able to do it, I think, unless we're really willing to take very seriously some of these other narratives and try to think about how to integrate them into the sexism narrative.
Unfortunately, I think our time is up. Before I ask you in joining me in thanking our guest, let me remind you, tomorrow, 4:30, Tom Newbig will be speaking about the tax bill and tax reform, and that's in Spark. And then at 7 tomorrow, Amy will be giving the Potter lecture, talking about the subject of her new book, and that's at 7 in Todd. 216. Todd. Join me now in thanking Amy.